Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of And Yet We Believe. I am Roger Pimentel. This is Ann Pimentel.
We are married.
Yes, we are. Welcome to the podcast. We got a great topic today.
Yeah. So this topic about traditional family values comes from a conversation that I had where I was a person and I were talking about somebody, political pundit.
We'll just go with that.
And I did not agree with this person that we were talking about, and the person I was talking to does agree with them. And I shared my opinion, and this person said, no, this political pundit just upholds traditional family values. And immediately I had a reaction of what I think traditional family values mean when people are talking about it in relation to politics. And so I wanted to do a discussion about that, about what traditional family values are, what they mean to different political parties, what they mean in the church. So let's jump in.
Yeah. And of course, this is not a political discussion. This is not
Right.
a political podcast. But you kind of can't get away from at least being political adjacent in this topic, because traditional family values, or some variation on that phrase, is floating around a lot in political circles, in kind of society at large. And I think the funny thing for me was when we were talking about this, we had this question, which was, wait, what are the values?
Yeah, what are they actually talking about?
Yeah, when we talk about traditional family values, what are the things that we're talking about?
Yeah. And when you Google what are traditional family values or define traditional family values, it talks about like patience and loyalty and honesty, but that is not what it means in a social context. That's not at least what most people are referring to when they say that. And as always, jump in the comments if you have thoughts on traditional family values. So I want to first share a little history of when this phrase started to be used more and what it has meant in a societal structure.
Great.
So, there's always a few years, give or take, here when we're talking about this. But what I found in my research was that this started in kind of the late 50s, early 60s into the 70s is when it kind of became a really big deal. So if you look at history of what was happening in that time, we have all of the racial strife that was going on. Desegregation of schools was happening. We have the end of the Vietnam War. We have Watergate. We have Roe v. Wade getting established. We have all of these things. And then also you add in the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, feminism. It's the second wave of feminism.
Right.
There was just a lot. There's Ronald Reagan. It was just a whole time period in that, late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And all of this, through all of this, the GOP was feeling like they were being attacked and that they wanted to, they needed to like root people and grab onto something that represented what they thought their beliefs or values or whatever it was.
Okay.
And so they started talking about these family values, traditional family values. And I actually have a quote from Ronald Reagan. And it's interesting because the quote doesn't sound horrible, right?
Okay, yeah.
But I think it has been co-opted now to mean something different. So he said, "Our goal is to help revive America's traditional values: faith, family, neighborhood, work, and freedom. Government has no business enforcing these values, but neither must it seek, as it did in the recent past, to suppress or replace them. That only robbed us of our tiller and set us adrift. Helping to restore these values will bring new strength, direction, and dignity to our lives and to the life of our nation. It's on these values that will best build our future."
That is the first time we've quoted Ronald Reagan
Yes.
on this podcast.
Yes, and possibly the last. But I think it's really interesting because he lists faith, family, neighborhood, work, and freedom as something that we need to revive in America. So if we are reviving freedom, who is that reviving for? Who is this family that they're talking about? What is the faith that they want to uphold and revive? What is the neighborhood? What does that look like? This was an incredible time. I mean, they were coming out of segregation,
right?
Of like Jim Crow laws. Like, this was a rough time, and it was not equal for every American. So saying this, and this is kind of the question we want to lean into a bit tonight, is when we talk about upholding these family values, whose family?
Right.
Who is that for? What are they talking about?
What families are we talking about?
Yeah.
Now, when I was a missionary, I kind of loved the church's identity around families, and the church has really doubled down on this identity. Especially, going back quite a few decades, you can look at the TV commercials, the family isn't it about time spots that ran for a long time. And did a lot to really kind of establish this brand for the church of like, yeah, families are our thing. And I remember being a missionary and thinking, hey, this is great. Everybody loves families. Like, who could be against that? Like, hey, we love family values. So does everybody.
Yeah.
Sort of a thing.
And how, like, you can just see the naiveness.
Naivete
coming through of like, what family? Your family had a mom and a dad and, siblings and whatever. And that was a certain ideal, certain look of family that you didn't even think about other families when you're like, yeah, everybody loves families.
Right. And so this is kind of the dark side of this is in certain cases when people are talking about family values, or especially like traditional family values, are they implying that only certain family structures are valid? Are they saying that specific gender roles are required? Are they saying that only certain sexual expressions are acceptable, or that certain authority structures have to be held up? When they're talking about family values, does that sometimes go into, and I'm just going to be frank about it, an anti-gay agenda? Upholding patriarchal structures.
Yep.
And so, we end up as Latter-day Saints looking at this and saying, okay, so how do we go being about families if only a narrow concept of families is supported?
Yeah. In Wikipedia, the truth of all research.
Yes, the fount of all knowledge.
It talks about, in traditional family values, you can look that up. It talks about how this, in a social science and the U.S. political discourse, the conventional term traditional family describes the nuclear family, a child-rearing environment composed of a leading father, a homemaking mother, and their nominally biological children. A family deviating from this model is considered a non-traditional family. So if you adopt, non-traditional.
Okay.
If you even have IVF, non-traditional. Possible non-traditional. If you are, if the mom works, let's say that, non-traditional. I question race in this. If you are a Black family or a Hispanic family or an Asian family,
are you excluded from that?
Yeah, are you considered traditional or non-traditional? And people will have varying answers on that, but society does treat families of color, people of color, a certain way.
Yep. Yeah, so boy, there's a lot to pick apart on this. And from a church perspective, it's really interesting to me to look at the focus on families in the last 50-ish years. Okay, so I did a little research from General Conference, and the term values really spiked a couple of decades ago in the 1990s. From like pretty much never being mentioned to like a huge spike in the 90s, and thankfully it's come down a tiny bit.
Okay.
Like, why was this such a big thing in the 90s? But I also looked at how much family was being talked about, and this was fascinating. Because mentions of family or families in General Conference spiked up huge in the 1970s and then stayed there through now-ish. And it went to a point where it was 4 to 5 times higher than it had been. So a very, very noticeable increase in general authorities talking about families in General Conference. Now, here's the interesting part. Families and everything that we talk about, doctrine of families, was not like a core doctrine in the time of Joseph Smith. It just did not carry the same weight. Now, you've got some pieces of it. You've got, the sealing power showing up in D&C 110. You have the New and Everlasting Covenant showing up in D&C 132. So you have kind of some of the puzzle pieces. But the church at the time was much more oriented around, gathering physically, building Zion. They just talked about different things at the time.
Well, and we know that Joseph and his father, they were Universalists. And so Joseph and Emma were being sealed to people, husbands and wives. Like they thought that we all just needed to be sealed as a family of God.
As a human family, yeah.
Right. And so they definitely understood that differently. And obviously we know all of the hidden stuff that that went on as well with polygamy. Sure. But it's important to recognize that when they talked about sealing power, it meant something different to them in Joseph's time than it even does now.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked before on this podcast about this concept of like the kind of Norman Rockwell painting nuclear family, white husband and father and their 2.5 kids or whatever.
Yeah. And the mom is in the kitchen and the husband is in his business attire.
Yep, and he goes to work and then he comes home. And again, this did not really exist in the time of Joseph Smith.
Right.
And it kind of accompanies industrial and maybe post-industrial revolution. It accompanies the rise of urban cities where jobs were centralized instead of just everybody being pastoral and agricultural. Right. So this concept of like a traditional family values or whatever didn't exist in the time of Joseph Smith. This is a much newer thing.
Right. And also, let's just mention, it's not lost on us that coincidentally today is the 30th anniversary of the proclamation of the family to the world, or whatever it's called. Yep. And that was in the 90s. Yep. And so obviously that's one reason it spiked, mention of families and stuff. That's one reason it spiked in the 90s at conference, mentions of family, because of the proclamation. There were probably talks for years after that were referencing that every time.
Yep.
And it really does beg the question in that proclamation, even what type of family are we upholding?
Right.
Because not every LDS family fits that ideal. Not every LDS family, like in any country, would fit this. And it's going to look different culture to culture. And so it's really hard to hold up a document that lays it out so like almost in a finality, like this is the way and we're gonna just go with this, and if you don't fit the mold, sorry.
Yeah, so I went through the family proclamation to see like what are the values that it talks about, and we could get really into the weeds on like what is a value, but I was trying to piece apart like values versus practices and some things like that. So there's some values in the family proclamation that we could probably get behind. Things like rearing children in love and righteousness. Awesome.
We can get behind that as long as it's not just the woman's job.
Right. See? And that's where it starts to bridge into practices. So like, okay, the value, yeah, we got it. Providing for their physical and spiritual needs. Got it. Teach them to love and serve one another. Got it. Randomly, it also says be law-abiding citizens. Okay, yeah, great. I don't really know how that fits in. That's great. But it also talks about cultural practices. And so it does talk about, husbands should preside and women should be in charge of nurturing the children. And those are ways, those are practices, those are ways to get to those values. But it is asserting that there's one way and it's the only right way. Mm-hmm. And that gets really challenging.
Yeah, especially in our modern time. Like, this is only 30 years old, but society has changed.
Yeah, sure.
Most families can't survive on one income. You know, it is almost a requirement as young people are getting married that both the husband and the wife have to work. Mm-hmm. And as children come, it is becoming ridiculously expensive to raise children, to try and figure out childcare if you need to be working, you know, all of that. And we're in a different world than we were even in the 90s.
Yep.
So yeah, we need some updates.
Well, I think the church has been, both from a policy standpoint and a culture standpoint, unable to wrap its brain around what you were calling what society or the church labels non-traditional families. Mm-hmm. We're just not able to get there. You know, LGBT couples for sure. Now, if we go back to those values, can an LGBT couple rear children in love and righteousness? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Can they provide for their physical and spiritual needs? Absolutely. Like, the values can be accomplished there, but from both a policy standpoint and a culture standpoint, the church struggles. The members of the church struggle with that. And I want to share an example. We lived in a ward where there was a woman who her husband had passed away. And so she was a single mother and had kids that were a whole range of ages. And we were at church, and I believe it was Father's Day. And Mother's Day and Father's Day are kind of fraught with peril for a lot of people. And some well-meaning speaker got up there and wanted to talk about how great fathers are. And this speaker did so by talking about how terrible your kids are going to turn out if they don't have a father.
Oh, dear.
Essentially. And like, oh, yeah, if they don't have a father, yeah, they're probably going to end up in prison and, you know, I don't know, whatever. But this poor sister, this single mother in our ward, was absolutely in tears. You know, hard enough that she had lost her husband, but now here she was sitting in church being told how inadequate she was and how, you know, her kids were all going to leave the church and be terrible people and whatever.
And she's just trying the best she can.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's an example of us not being culturally equipped for anything other than that extremely traditional, picture-perfect family. Yeah. And I think for this speaker, they didn't have any other context. They just know, oh, this is how my family works. I have a great dad. My husband's a great dad, you know, whatever.
And all the kids worked out.
And, yeah, exactly. And so it's like, hey, this is perfect for me. And so I'm going to share this with everybody. And it was just an example of us not being prepared for that.
Yeah. It's a good example of centering ourselves and our experiences. Mm-hmm. And that is always damaging because there are always people in the room that are experiencing something different.
Yep.
So I want to talk a little bit of, you know, I started this out by sharing that this woman I had talked to said that this political pundit upheld traditional family values. And I immediately was like, oh, I know what you mean. Because you're not talking about rearing children and, you know, whatever it is. When I hear that, I have a very specific thought, and I'll share my thought in a minute. But I did a poll on my account, my Instagram account, and I want to share some of those responses from people of when they hear traditional family values, what does that mean to them? What are they hearing?
Okay, so this is not even our opinion.
No,
this is
all of your opinions. Okay, and I'm going to read these with no comment. Here they come. Homophobic and patriarchal views. No LGBT. No abortion. Mom stays home. Mother, father, children. Strict heterosexual gender roles and blonde babies.
Wow.
1960s cooking ads type vibe. Anti-LGBTQ. Close-mindedness. Far-right anti-LGBTQIA. A veneer to present misogyny, queerphobia, and exploitation of labor with a positive spin. Traditional as male lead. I believe in traditional family values, but if someone else says it, I hear anti-gay. Trad fam values. Traditional family values is a politically and spiritually loaded phrase to uphold hardline total patriarchy and suppress women into total subservience. And then one person said, a loving, supportive home. Loving, supportive home.
We got all sides represented.
Right? So this is what people hear. And I don't know, it would be interesting to see, has it always meant this to people? And I do think for most of the time, we started this out with the history of desegregation, and homophobia was coming in big, and anti-feminism was coming in, and that's when they started talking about traditional family values. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that means that traditional family values has always been anti-LGBTQ. Mm. It has always been women stay home and work. It has always been have this cookie cutter family. And it's not about honesty and patience and love. And if it was about those things, I could get behind that, because any family, like you were saying earlier, any family situation, any family makeup can teach honesty, can teach spiritual things, can teach whatever it is, but that's not what they mean.
Right. Yeah, and it's almost like you have to define your terms every time you say it.
Right.
Because it's like traditional family values. I mean caring for each other and creating safe spaces for children to grow up. Like those are the values I'm talking about, because otherwise, and it does get kind of politically loaded in that case, because that's where it now starts to align with political platforms.
Right.
And that gets problematic.
Here's a quote from James Hillman. I don't know who that is.
I don't know either.
Honest talk. We don't know who this is.
Yeah.
He says, when they talk about family values, it's in a repressive way, as if our American tradition were only the Puritan tradition or the 19th century oppressive tradition, the Christian tradition. Mm. So Christian traditional family values is another layer added onto this, which I think works with just traditional family values, but when you add Christian to it, it screams of Christian nationalism to me. And so that gets really freaky to me, because our country was formed on religious freedom, that everyone can come here and worship who they want and how they want. That's one of our articles of faith. Yep. So when we throw Christianity on top of it and we make that a requirement for goodness in America, then we're running into problems.
Yeah, well, and there's a great comment in the chat here about kind of societally trying to make traditional families mean normal families, trying to normalize a specific image of a family. And more and more, that's not the family.
Yeah.
There's every possible variation of family out there, and that's great. And they can all have those values of caring for each other and supporting each other and, all of those good things. I think we can accomplish those things if that's actually what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
But I think that's not generally what's being talked about.
And I think people will typically throw out a red herring sort of explanation of, well, there's all this research that children need a man and a woman in their home. Mm. There is not enough research on the success of kids coming out of LGBTQ relationships either.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think because it's been illegal for so long to have a legalized marriage, and so I just don't think that we can say that with certainty when we don't have research giving a different perspective.
Well, and I think it depends what you're trying to accomplish by citing research in that case.
Right.
Because if it's just to make this poor sister in our ward whose husband died, if it's just to make her feel bad, that's not going to help.
Well, and if it's to squash LGBTQ, that's also not going to help anything.
It's also not working.
Right. And we don't want it to work. That we have to be able to broaden our understanding of what family means. Yeah. And that quote that you kind of referenced earlier of the Norman Rockwell family, it's from Patrick Mason from Restoration, and he says, we often think that when we say that we need to return to our heavenly parents, that that's our goal as a church. we have in our mind that it's this Norman Rockwell family, but really our heavenly parents are concerned about getting their family back.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what we look like, what the family looks like, or who the person is. They want all of their children back, full stop.
Yep. I love that. You know, it's interesting when you look at the rise of narrative about family in the church, which again kind of picks up in the 1970s through today, to the point where the church's identity publicly is really anchored pretty hard in families. That's something the church has doubled down on. Great. Okay, awesome. But LDS folks weren't the most influential in getting to where families are societally today. And you could probably make a pretty solid case that our church followed right on the heels of evangelical movements from the 70s up through the 90s and into today. This was people like Phyllis Schlafly. Whew.
No, I think it is Schlafly.
Oh man, I might have butchered that in a couple of ways. But even like James Dobson, who just died a few weeks ago.
Focus on the Family guy.
His thing was called Focus on the Family.
That's the guy that did VeggieTales, if anyone's curious.
Absolutely. But his and Phyllis Schlafly's also was a very narrow definition of a family. There were people speaking out in LDS circles, notably Ezra Taft Benson, big fan of complementarian gender roles, women not working outside the home, that sort of thing. But that was well after that stake was put in the ground in evangelical Christianity. Yeah. And so even while our church has really staked a claim to families, I don't think we led the way to where we are now in an orientation around the family.
Yeah. Well, and we've kind of mentioned it before, but it just keeps coming back to my mind of how much this screams white supremacy. Mm-hmm. All of this stuff is veiled in white supremacy and racism, and there is a lot of harm that comes from that. And as white people, when we say, well, we're just upholding traditional family values, a Black family has never been the traditional norm of anything in America.
Who are we leaving out by saying that?
Yeah. And this is where people say, well, I'm not racist. That's not something I am. But when you uphold that value, that phrase, you want that to happen, you are subliminally saying, we want this white family to be upheld and this Black family to not, because of all the things that this means. And if we go back through that history of what kind of caused traditional family values to come up, it was always at the expense of marginalized people.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I asked this question earlier about how, as Latter-day Saints, can we be about families if that tends to be a narrow concept of what a family is. Here's what I think.
Okay.
I think it doesn't have anything to do with what you choose to do and how you live your life. Who you marry, what your family looks like. If you want to be in a family with a husband and wife and your 2.5 kids and the husband presides and the wife is a homemaker, great. Do that. If your family looks different, great. I'm all about it. Great. Because I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it has everything to do with judging others, allowing or not allowing rights to others, and whether we are being as loving and inclusive as Jesus Christ was.
Yeah.
In the story about the woman caught in adultery in the New Testament, are we the men looking for permission from Jesus to throw the stones because he's not going to give it? Mm-hmm. And Elder Renlund a number of years ago in General Conference quoted Brian Stevenson about we need to be not throwing stones, we need to be catching stones. He said, not throwing stones. Not throwing stones is the first step in treating others with compassion. The second step is to try to catch stones thrown by others. That's Elder Renlund referencing Brian Stevenson in that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot in here about wanting to tell other people what to do.
And how to set up their family.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not really what Jesus taught.
He didn't even teach about families in this traditional way. So
yeah, that's totally fair. And again, neither did really Joseph Smith. This is a much newer
well,
concept.
that goes to the comment here. LDS families once meant having multiple wives, and now it doesn't. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is a moving target, it seems.
yeah, and it's pointed out that definition of what families mean in the church might change again.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe we're rooted in some older ideas now. Maybe there's going to be some evolution forward. I don't think we need to throw out the concept of families. Again, this undergirding of actual values of love and commitment and,
mm-hmm.
Raising resilient children, all of these things still hold. But the Savior taught us to love everybody. I don't think we can be judging people for their families.
Yeah.
And be doing that.
It reminds me of the quote from President Hinckley where he said, bring what good things you have, what good values and traditions you have, and let us build on it. And if we apply that to every different way a family looks, like let's broaden our definition of what a family is and bring your gay family,
mm-hmm.
gay couple with kids, and let's build on it. And how can we help you thrive? And isn't it all about having humanity thrive and
right.
looking toward God and trying to return to our heavenly parents? Isn't that just the point? And so why are we setting all of these stipulations that really just exclude people?
Right.
We should just be more inclusive.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're all spiritual siblings. We're all on this journey together, and we can either help each other along the way or set booby traps for each other along the way.
Yeah, be a stumbling block for others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
That was kind of a tough topic.
Yeah. We tried to not get political, so...
Yeah, how'd we do?
Yeah, it's tough.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We're going to wrap up, and we will see you again next week.
See you later.